So let's look at our next type of fancy ligand. So we talked about a sigma complex in our previous video. So let's imagine these two complexes. We're going to compare and contrast them a little bit. So if I'm trying to draw out all my atoms here just to be nice and clear about the types of bonding that I'm describing here, right, I could imagine that I have an ethylene unit that is bound to my metal center. And if I was going to separate this, the neutral form of this ligand, right, if we're doing our electron counting, I would end up with my metal, and the carbon would have one electron to get to this neutral state. So this would look like an X-type ligand, right? And so this would affect the oxidation state of our metal and our d electron count. This is not a fancy ligand. This is essentially a ligand that we would have seen back in our first set of lectures on coordination chemistry. So how do we make this into a fancy ligand, right? What makes it a fancy ligand? Well, these types of complexes exist that's going to look a lot like our sigma complex, where we have our unit of ethylene, and the metal is actually bonding, it's interacting with the pi system, right? So it's the metal is interacting with the pi system of our ligand, right? And this is kind of weird, right? So if we're going to try to draw the picture of what's happening here, this is not a sigma complex. This is different than a sigma complex because in this picture we have our metal, we have our carbons, and I'm going to try to draw this with some three-dimensional shapes so we can kind of get a better picture of what's happening here. With these hydrogens attached, and on our metal center, we have our d orbitals, right? So we go back to the pictures of our d orbitals that we have. Kind of looks like our good old Mickey Mouse ears until we're actually done drawing it. So we have d orbitals on our metal, and these can actually interact with the entire pi system of our ligand, right? So we want to go back and review, right? What does sigma and pi bonds look like? So we can make this shaded so we can kind of see how this interaction works. But the important thing here is that the metal, right, the metal is connected, right? It's connected to both carbons through this pi system. And this type of bonding really doesn't fit into our kind of old patterns for bonding, our old understanding of how this works. And if we're going to look at this pi system, again, this is just a single pi system. So this is a 2-electron donor, right? So that means that our pi bonds can be L-type ligands. So this can extend to much larger pi systems than just 2 atoms. So let's look at what these different ones look like. All right, so we've talked about how if we have a metal that's bound to an ethylene, right? So this is C2H4 that's in there. I'm just abbreviating it. When we separate this out, we're left with just our ethylene, right? So C double bond C with our H's. And this is a 2-electron donor, right? And this would essentially be an L type. And I'm going to put this in parentheses because we generally wouldn't use the same like polydentate abbreviations for this, and we'll get to that in a second, right? But if just for electron counting purposes, this looks like a 2-electron ligand. A metal could be bound to 3 carbons, right? And so I'm going to use this arc to say the pi system of 3 carbons. Well, what on earth does a pi system for 3 carbons look like? Well, we would have carbon, carbon, carbon with 2 hydrogens, 1 hydrogen, and 2 hydrogens, right? So this is all in conjugation. And in order to make this neutral, right, one of our carbons would need a free electron. And so this looks like a 3-electron donor. And in fact, it is a 3-electron donor. And if we're paying attention to our oxidation state, this acts like an XL type ligand, right? So the L type is our kind of pi bond, and our X type is that free electron. And so we can have 3 atoms and they are all bound to our metal, right? So this is different than the polydentate ligand. Polydentate ligands had multiple binding sites that were separate from each other. Here we're describing an entire pi system that is bound to our metal, right? So these are slightly different things. We can have 4 atoms that are bound to a metal center. Sorry, there shouldn't be the pi bond on there right now. Right, the way we describe these types of bonds is you have the arc that covers the atoms that are bound to the metal, and we draw the metal as if it has a bond pointed towards that arc. So if we're going to draw this out, right, we would have our butadiene here, and so this would be a 4-electron donor, and it would look like an L2 style ligand. Right? Each of those pi systems could be considered a 2-electron donor, but again, this isn't polydentate, so we're not splitting them up. We can have aromatic rings, so we can have 5- and 6-membered rings as well. Right? So this is called a cyclopentadienyl ring. That circle means it's a fully aromatic system that is bound to our metal center. This ligand is special. It's called a CP ligand for cyclopentadienyl. If we're going to separate this out, right, and we're going to try to draw a structure that allows us to explain its reactivity in the way that it binds, this is actually a 5-electron donor, right? And it looks kind of like an XL2 type ligand. Now, like I said, I'm going to put the parentheses around these XL kind of labels because those are not really the way we refer to haptic ligands. So I just kind of spilled the beans. These ligands are what we call haptic ligands because they are bound to multiple continuous atoms. So polydentate ligands had multiple binding sites. Haptic ligands are bound to multiple atoms in a row. And we have a special way of describing the number of atoms that are bound. So we use eta, and then the superscript describes the number of atoms that are bound in a row. So here I had 2 carbons that were bound. So this ligand would be an eta-2 style ligand. In our next example, we had 3 carbons that were bound, right? 1, 2, 3. So we could call this an eta-3 ligand because there are 3 continuous atoms that are bound to our metal center. Continuing down the trend, right? 1, 2, 3, and 4, we have eta-4 style ligands. And lastly, eta-5 ligands is our CP ligand. So again, this has this special name CP. One of our labs in 484 deals with the molecule ferrocene, which is a historically relevant organometallic complex that is an iron with 2 different CP rings attached. So we have these haptic ligands where we have multiple the metal is bound to multiple atoms in a row. And this is different than a polydentate ligand where a single ligand had multiple binding sites, right, but weren't necessarily bound in a row. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to give you a little bit of a challenge, right, and just kind of continue this trend out. What would the 6-member system be, right? So this would just be a benzene ring, right? How many electrons are donated here, right? Electrons donated. If you're going to describe this using the eta, right, what value would go up here? What should be our superscript? And similarly, we can describe this in different ways. So I'm going to draw 2 more pictures, and I want you to compare and contrast them a little bit. And we'll pick this up in class when we talk about these in our next class. Right, so I'm going to draw you 2 more pictures of benzene. These are known bonding patterns between transition metals and benzene. Right? So what on earth is that? Right? What does that mean in terms of binding? Go back and think about what is that arc telling you about the hapticity of our ligand? Right? And here's another bonding mode of benzene. So try to compare and contrast these three different pictures. How many electrons are donated? How might you describe the hapticity of the bonding in these three different cases? All right, so now we've introduced polydentate ligands. We've introduced sigma donor ligands, right? Sigma complexes where actual chemical bonds can serve as our electron source for a bond with a transition metal. And now we've introduced this idea of haptic ligands, ligands that are bound to multiple continuous atoms in a system. We now know how to count their electrons and label them using this weird eta notation to describe how many atoms are bound in a row.